Welcome to the All of Life podcast from Redemption Church Tempe, where we have conversations on faith, culture, theology, and beyond to help us live all of life, all for Jesus. Let's jump into today's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the All of Life podcast. My name is Warren Williams, and today I'm joined by our co-lead pastor of Redemption Tempe, Josh Butler.
Hello.
And also our pastor of communities, John Crawford.
Hey.
So it's good to have you guys on.
Good to be on.
Yeah, for sure. So today, guys, where we're going to be going is we're going to be talking about how an understanding of how we are made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and how we bear the likeness of God, how important it is to our faith, and how important it will play a role in how we treat the different things that we have to deal with in life, like our work, right? How we interact with others, how we approach a lot of the big issues that we see in our culture. The Imago Dei is going to be fundamental to how we look at those things. So we're going to be talking about the image of God, and we're going to talk through the different views of the image of God that we see just expressed in church history, and the different writings of theologians, and just their three kind of pronged view that we see expressed in the different writings historically. So before we get to that, before we get to a lot of those big ideas, I just want to start at the basics, right? I mentioned the image of God. Like, what even is that? What are we even talking about today?
Yeah.
What is the image of God? Where does it show up in Scripture? And then we'll talk about, how it's been understood historically. But let's just, at the basics, what is it? What is the image of God?
Great, man. Yeah. Well, so the image of God, where does it show up in Scripture? Sure. Page 1, actually. Genesis 1, the opening of the biblical story actually front loads and centers the image of God, which makes this a really significant theme throughout the biblical story. And what is it? It's some type of capacity for us as human beings to reflect God into his world, to image him or reflect the character, the nature of God into the world. Now, there have been three ways historically that the image has been understood. And I found these helpful because usually I found many of us are familiar and assume one view.
Right.
But there's actually a couple of them.
Right.
Totally. And what struck me looking at all three back in the day was going like, oh man, I've been missing out. I've been missing out on the good. It's kind of, I've been eating one course meal. There's a 3-course meal here. And I think it's helpful. So I want to talk about these three views. They're called the substantive, the functional, and the relational view. Those sound like big heady terms. We'll break them down.
Yeah.
Substantive, the functional, relational. And I think it's helpful to think of these three views less as like competing options and more as like a multifaceted diamond.
Yeah.
Like sides of a diamond, right? Like the image of God is like this diamond with many facets to it. And these are angles to get us into what is the diamond, right?
That's good. Yeah.
So let's talk, kind of break these down. What are they and how do they show up in Genesis 1? So the substantive view, you hear the word substance in there. It's going, hey, the image of God, this view saying it's in the substance of our being, something within us, our substance. So it's the image is something that we have within us, right? The most dominant view of this historically was probably the view of reason, that our reason. And I think we see this in Genesis 1, our reason, our capacity to think about the world. We see this in Genesis 1 in that God creates humanity different from the animals, like over the animals. And he calls them to like make something of his world, to rule the world. And reason is pretty significant to that, right? Like we're able to build, eyeglasses and skyscrapers in New York City. Like animals don't do that. Like, we have a capacity to actually fulfill the cultural mandate, make some of God's world. And that actually reflects something of God, who is the mastermind behind all creation, right?
Yeah.
Or God as creator is a front-loaded theme. Genesis 1, God introduced himself as with creativity, right? Like he doesn't make a world that's stick figures in a black and white landscape. Like he makes form and color, all these things. That one of the ways we can reflect God into his world is with creativity and imagination, making things that weren't there before and all that. But some people struggle with that. One challenge to this view is going, okay, well, if it's reason or creativity, then what if you are mentally disabled? Let's say you're in a car accident and your IQ's damaged, then do you not have the image of God within you? Well, no. A little bit later in Genesis 9, we see God deal with us. He says, hey, the reason murder is so bad is because you kill anyone, they're made in the image of God. And it applies it to all humanity. So someone said, hey, the image of God is, there's a basic dignity that all people have and that all people share just to being human. The image of God is a kind of a dignity that we have. So we could talk about the functional and the relational in a minute, but I'm curious the substantive. Yes, that's kind of the idea there. Curious your guys' thoughts. Does that make sense? Ring a bell.
I mean, I think it's so good to see, to understand, to unpack this at the beginning of the biblical story, because there is something. The word that you just used, Josh, just dignity of. For us as humans, even right now culturally, there's so much emphasis on human rights, right? Universal rights. Well, where does that come from? And is it just to a certain subset of people, or is it to those who are terminally ill, those who have mental illness, those who are born with disabilities? And so I think this is pertinent for us to understand that we all are made in the image of God. And exactly like what you just referenced in Genesis 9, even about, man, the reason why murder is wrong is because you're taking the life of an image bearer, and that every single one of us are made in God's image. And we're like mirrors, right? To reflect him. Yeah. And we reflect him. And that means regardless of if it's a cognitive disability or if it's a physical disability or if you have terminal illness, you still are a mirror to reflect the very image of God, meaning you have dignity. Your life has value. And that's the thing that Christianity, from the very beginning, Christianity is what has created this idea of universal rights. So it is founded on what we believe, and exactly what you just said is it's on the first page of the Bible.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like, we take for granted today, say human rights in Western culture is just like, oh yeah, it's just something we all have. And well, why do we have it? Oh, we just do, and everyone just assumes that. But you go back historically, nowhere in history, like nobody believed that. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
And the place that there's a scholar named Nicholas Wolterstorff who wrote a fascinating book called Justice, Rights and Wrongs. It's been a while. I think that was the name of it. But anyways, Wolterstorff's a philosopher, but he traces the idea of where did human rights come from, and he and others, and like the scholarly tradition, another great new book called Dominion that came out by a famous historian out in the UK, famously traces this theme, but going like human rights is one of those things that it's come into our culture through the Jewish and Christian tradition, rooted in the image of God, and God, the dignity that we have as image bearers and God's love for us is actually the legal foundation in the Middle Ages from which human rights developed and grew out of. And so the irony today is often like, the claim would be we're still living off that borrowed capital of our history, but we've cut ourselves off from the roots from which it came. And so there's a concern of going, man, is it going to sustain? You look at many places around the world that don't believe in human rights, and today it's even legally getting pressed like, well, why in international law? Why should we hold human rights? And they're having a hard time backing it up because we cut ourselves off from the foundation and the roots.
That's right. Yeah. One of the things that I've heard that it's like really always resonated with me was, in our country, we had the civil rights era, right? And I think that word, civil rights, I think we all kind of know what that means. But really what we're looking at is like a human dignity, image of God movement, right? Where people are saying, because we are made just like you in the image of God, that there are rights that are like indelible to us, that are innate in us, that are not being respected, that are not being honored.
Yeah.
Totally. And so even like with, our current conversation around race and justice, how does this view implicate that current conversation? I know we've kind of talked on it, but is there direct things that we can draw out from this view on that into that conversation?
Totally, man. I mean, you look historically, maybe just kind of start historically for Israel, in Israel's law, their legal code for the nation as a whole, that God had given them. God gave Israel a law that essentially said, you need to treat others like image bearers. Don't treat people like they did when they were slaves, when you were slaves in Egypt. Don't treat people how you were treated when you were slaves in Egypt. And so you need to treat people like image bearers, and with a particular concern for those who were at risk or more vulnerable to being mistreated, So then you go through church history, and because of the image of God, you read through the early church, the Middle Ages, the modern era, like Christians who took their Bibles most seriously said, we need to have a particular eye out for, yes, everyone's life bears dignity important to God, and yet that bears a special importance if there are those in our society who are more at risk of being mistreated or are more vulnerable to mistreatment and all. And so you look at that today, and as the people of God, we should be concerned first and foremost within the church as the people of God.
Right.
Are there people in our midst, in our churches that we're dreaming of?
Yeah.
And then for our society as a whole, like, dude, how can we advocate for a more just society where wherever, whether because of race or class or creed or sex or gender, wherever area, that if there are people who are more at risk of discrimination or mistreatment or being treated as something less than or other than image bearers, like, that's an assault on God's imprint upon humanity.
Yeah.
Right.
And as a church and as a society, we begin to come under judgment if we don't take that seriously.
That's so good.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with everything you said, Josh. It's that I feel like with this too, it's important when you have a conversation around race and justice where you see some of the most horrific atrocities throughout world history. It's because the image of God has not been recognized and upheld.
Right.
And so even if you take the conversation about race, racism, slavery in our country, the very reason why this happened was because slaveholders argued that Africans were less than human.
Yeah.
That they did not have the same dignity, that they were somehow not of the same humanity as the slaveholders. And so therefore you built an entire system off of disbelief in the image of God. And it's not even just with slavery and racism specifically, but we see it. I mean, that's what happened in Nazi Germany. With
eugenics,
yeah,
right? Like these different.
It's what happened in Rwanda with the genocide of the Hutus and the Tutsis, of an entire group of people being said that you're cockroaches, right? And it leads to this genocide, and we see it play out with Lenin and Red Terror, and all of that is like, dude, the roots of all of these things is related to what we believe about the image of God. Yeah. And so I think it's massively important, especially in our conversations around race and justice today.
So good, so good. So I feel like that view, their first view, the substance, I can't even say it right, but the substance that we have of the image of God, I feel like that is probably the most commonly known.
Yes.
So that's like probably what all of us kind of just understand, maybe from church or just seeing it in society. We get that. But these next couple of views are maybe a little bit more unfamiliar.
Yes.
So the next view that we mentioned is the functional view.
Yeah.
Right. And so this view that looks at like how God's image is expressed and how like human beings have dominion over creation, right?
Yeah.
The created order. Tell us more, Josh, about like this functional view of the image of God and how do we see it play out in Scripture? Where do we see it in Scripture?
Great. No, that's great. So the functional view, if the substantive view is saying, hey, it's something we have, the functional view is saying it's something that we do. Like the image is something that we do in the world. And this comes from, as God is introducing the image of God, he says, let's make the atom in our image, humanity in our image, so that they may rule. Like, let them rule is kind of the context, right? And this view takes into consideration the historical context in the ancient Near East of what it meant to be in the image of God. So countries around it, Israel wasn't the only nation that believed in the image of God. Like the language was used all around the ancient world.
In Babylon, right? Mesopotamia, they had that same sort of language with their kings, right?
Totally. But that's the thing, is it applied only to the king. Right.
Yeah.
Like it was Pharaoh was made in the image of God. You were not. Caesar was made in the image of God. You were not.
Yeah.
And what it meant was you had a legitimate right as the representative for God or the gods to rule on their behalf. Like, so being made in the image of the gods basically meant that, hey, I'm the king, I have divine right to rule over my country, right?
Yeah.
And what these kings would do is they would create images of themselves, like statues, and they would place them throughout the empire, throughout their kingdom, right? And so if you're Joe Schmo, you're walking through the land, every time you saw that that image, that statue, you'd go, that's an image of the God. It's an image of the king who is an image of the God, right?
Yeah.
And so the images of the gods were like these statues throughout the land that represented the king or the ruler who had this divine right to rule. Now, what's so shocking about Genesis here is that he's saying, let them, all humanity, the humanity he's about to create, right?
Yeah.
And scholars say like, they call this like a revolution. This was a revolution in the ancient world. And this was that sense, that, kind of from another angle again, that all humanity is royalty. It's going to say all humanity has been given a vocation or a call to steward the earth, to cultivate God's creation, to rule, right? And I feel like we're getting a little closer here to some of the heart of the image, is that God has a project for humanity to rule here. You think about rule in Genesis 1, and I think we can today think of that as like domination or exploitation, or I get to be in charge, kind of thing. And I mean, there's a sense of like ownership, responsibility, and those kind of things. But we're talking about gardening, agricultural society. And there's what in the Reformed traditions, we're reformed in our Reformed tradition, we often call like the cultural mandate. There's this call to unpack the earth, like to actually bring forth the culture from the garden of creation, that the garden is going to become a city, and we're partners with God in ruling his earth, stewarding his creation, bringing forth its riches to bring forth culture. And Genesis 1 is saying all humanity is royalty that's been given that call to partner with God as his royal priesthood, mediating his presence in the earth by helping to turn the garden into a temple, a place fit for God's presence together with his people.
Dude, that's great. And I feel like there's so many implications for that.
Yeah, let's get into some of that. Like, what
even on like you used the word vocation, right?
Yeah.
Like and royalty.
Yeah.
And I feel like, so much of our all of life ethos about what we believe and pressing into faith and work with our all of life interviews that I'm sure many of you have seen those, heard those before in the life of our church, but this is really where it comes from, right? This cultural mandate about why work is good is that we are made in the image of God, and God has commissioned us and given us this cultural mandate to steward his creation, to rule and to reign and to be co-creators. And, it's like Jim Mullins obviously always, using all sorts of examples, but I'm looking at all of us right now. We got microphones in front of us, iPhones on the table, computers, like in Genesis 1, God could have made these things fall from the sky.
Exactly.
But instead, he buried the potential for these things, and he hid them in creation, and then commissions us and makes us in his image to then go and ultimately unearth these things, to cultivate the potential of these things. And now we've got phones and computers and tables and eyeglasses, microphones, all these things. And so I think that there's a lot to be said on vocation. I'd love to hear you guys as well, just on this vocation piece here.
Yeah, I think it breaks down like the sacred secular dichotomy or divide of going, okay, the image is what I do at church on Sunday, or the image of God is what I do with my neighbors and my personal life, whatever. Going, no, dude, you're spending 40, 50 plus hours a week at your job.
Right.
Yeah.
That's actually a place that you image God. Like maybe not if you're in the mafia or I don't know, dude, but like or at least you're not imaging God well there.
Right.
But like going like, dude, like let's say you're a mechanic, and you're changing tires, and you just go, this isn't holy work. This isn't whatever. Like, no, dude, like that's actually a part of for a flourishing society. I do know how to change my tire, but I suck at it, right? Right. I'm saying this because I had to go to the tire shop on Sunday, right? Yeah. And I'm like, dude, hey, I need my alignment checked, my threads, like stuff I don't know how to do, but they have a specialty skill set from stuff that's been developed from creation that actually, like, that's helping. That's not just a paycheck. That's actually helping society flourish. That's helping me as a neighbor that they may not know, but I'm a neighbor, and they're helping me be able to get my kids to school this morning, be able to get here and be part of this. And, so like our jobs, our work is a part of cultivating creation and the flourishing of humanity and like being a community. And those aren't just like separate from a life with God. Those are ways that we're called to image.
Yeah. I think this view has probably been the most impactful on me in most recent years. I remember a conversation I had with a friend around my work when I was working for a trucking company and helping to coordinate shipments around the country of food. I remember they asked me, and this person was like, they were so passionate about what they're doing. I remember just responding to, I was like, it's just a job. It's just a means to an end. It's just a way that we can, I can support myself. It doesn't really have any sort of great or grand importance. And, viewing things this way, like what John talked about, even how we frame a lot of the things and help people to rethink what the work that they're doing in our all of life interviews. It's like, I wasn't just moving trucks around a map, right? Like I was reflecting God's character as a provider, right? How he provides for us and provides our daily bread on our tables. I was doing that through my work. And so
Yeah.
I think this view is just extremely important, and especially like we've talked about, just when you think about your work, because I think it's so easy for just us to compartmentalize a lot of our times our faith and not see, how what we're doing each day, what we're doing for 40 hours a week, how it truly reflects the aspects of God's character.
The other thing on that too, on work, is this is Genesis 1, and what Josh just talked about here. This is before sin has entered the world.
Right.
And so I think a lot of, when we talk about vocation, I mean, how many of us are like, I work so I can live.
Right.
Like work sucks.
Right.
Exactly. The only reason why I work
Means
is so I can,
end.
it's a means to an end.
Means to
Give
an
me a
end.
paycheck.
Right.
But what we see here is like the human vocation. God was a worker, made us in his image.
Right.
Like work is good before sin enters the world, and it has intrinsic value, which means what Josh just said about, man, there's this sacred secular divide that doesn't exist. But also, like, God made you to work,
Right.
And you're imaging him, and you're being a co-creator in this cultural mandate as you work. And so work is good, and we were created to work.
Hopefully that's really encouraging for you if you're working right now. That provides a little boost to your day. Another aspect of creation, I think, or just the image of God that we see that's really cared for in this view is just even like the care for creation, right? The care for the environment that, when we talk about rule, it doesn't mean exploiting the environment for our own purposes, but actually like caring. So like there's like ecological sort of implications in this view as well. So that's good. I think that was extremely helpful, and hopefully if you didn't know about the functional view of God, that helped, that gave you a kind of foundational understanding. So let's move into the third view.
Great.
The relational view.
Relational view,
Yeah.
yes.
So let's talk about, this view talks about how the image of God is expressed and how we relate to him and others. But yeah, Josh, would you walk us through what does this view say?
So relational view. So if the substantive view is saying the image is something we have, functional view is saying, hey, it's something that we do. The relational view is going, it's someone that we are, that we are made relationally by a relational God. And where do we see this in Genesis? I'd say this is at the heart of the image, right? So when we look at Genesis 1, Genesis 1:27 it's a poem, and it's a 3-line poem, and it's the climax of Genesis 1, right? So the substance view, let's say like reason, we're different from the animals, all that, that's kind of like the bigger context of we're different than the animals, all that. Then you move a little closer to Genesis 1:26, like letting them rule and vocation, those kind of things, is like God's kind of setting up the poem. But then in the heart of the poem itself, the image of God poem, and for scripture like this, Genesis 1, ancient Hebrew poetry or passages like this, to put a poem right here, it's saying that this is the climax of the passage. Like Genesis 1 has all been building towards this. You'll see this in Genesis 2 as well. The whole story, the narrative builds towards a poem at the end. And it's kind of going, hey, pay attention. This is kind of the point, right? So let's look at this poem. We're going to go kind of a little theology nerd here for a minute, a little geeky, right? But it's worth it. Believe me, it'll pay off. So Genesis 1:27, 3-line poem, line 1. So God created the Adam in his own image. Now, most of our English translations is going to say God created man or mankind, that kind of thing. In Hebrew, it's ha-Adam. God is creating the Adam in his image, which is interesting because what it's saying is it's corporate humanity. Like God is creating all humanity in his image. Now, the next 2 lines are going to unpack, in Hebrew poetry, you kind of line 1 is your big idea, and then line 2 and 3 in a poem like this are expounding on what's on that big idea. So God creates the Adam, or humanity, mankind in his image. Then line 2, in the image of God, he created him. Line 3, male and female, he created them. And what we see is that line 2 says it emphasizes the unity of humanity. In the image of God, he created him. Now, we hear that word him, we're thinking like, okay, he just creates the dude or something, right? But in Hebrew, it's more, it's a corporate pronoun, right? It's referring to humanity, but as one thing, right? Like the human social body as one thing. Like we are one, we're humanity. And then line 3 says, male and female, he created them. And it's a plural, right? And so what is embedded in the heart of this poem is diversity in union. That God creates one humanity that has a unity together as humanity and a diversity as male and female is kind of seen as like the core diversity running through the human race, right? So we are one and we are many. And it's interesting, like, so Karl Barth, often considered like the most significant Protestant theologian of the 20th century, and Pope John Paul II, like the most significant Catholic thinker on marriage, like issues of the sexuality in the body.
Yeah.
They both agreed on this. They said at the heart of the image of God, communion of persons is the image of God. That we are not separate individuals like billiard balls all bouncing around against each other on our own. And we're also not just cogs in the machine. Like we are made as a communion of persons, diversity and union, to reflect a triune God. God's created us to reflect his image and our very relational nature within the fabric of our humanity. And that is, dude, I mean, I just think that's so powerful. Like we are made relationally by a relational God. One note on here too, it's interesting, like when you read in the early church, when they talked about the image of God, there's an interesting study by this guy, Henry de Lubac, a famous study back in the 1920s, this theologian, but he was studying the patristics, like the early church fathers. How did they understand the image of God? And what he realized was when we talk about the image of God today, we primarily talk about it as an individual thing. You have the image, right?
Totally.
Because when the early church talked about it, they primarily talked about a corporate thing, right? And we are all created in Adam. You see this image a lot in the New Testament, like we're created in Adam. Yep. And so the idea that you see a lot in the church fathers is humanity was created to together, corporately, collectively, together reflect the image of God into his world as a united social body. Then what sin has done is it has fractured the image of God. It has torn apart humanity. It has ripped apart human social body into warring, divided nations, and competition and conflict and hostility and all that. And so what Jesus is doing through his crucifixion and resurrection is he is bringing the family back together, right? Like he is restoring the human social body. What was torn apart to dissolution and death in Adam, Jesus is reconciling and reuniting and restoring. Jesus is the image of God as an individual, the true, full, like he properly and accurately reflects God into the world. And he is reuniting and reconciling and restoring us in him as the image of God, as a united one body, one church, that we would be one as he and the Father are one. And that our diversity and union, being one body with many parts as the church, one kingdom of every nation, tribe, and tongue, one spirit animated in us, but through a diversity of gifts, like God's spirit, like that is us becoming, as the church, a reflection of the triune God, like a more accurate reflection of the God who is.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. Josh, thanks for hitting on too in the midst of all the gems you just dropped on us. Just the answering the question, hey, does sin distort or diminish the image of God, right? Because that seems to be like one of the points of contention where different theologians landed differently, like just kind of on whether sin does or does not reduce, the image of God or dim it, in some ways. So I think that was really helpful. And also, just your point, like on diversity of union. I've heard you talk about this, and it's great. You have so much great stuff on that. But like when we think about that in terms of like probably one of the biggest issues of our day is around like topics of sex and gender.
Yeah.
Right? Like how does that,
Great.
how does this view kind of speak into those issues? And especially as you think about, or as you talked about like diversity of union, how do we see that play out?
Yes.
And implicate these issues that
Great.
sex and gender.
Genesis 1 is telling us, I believe here, that sexual difference as male and female is the deepest core diversity running through the heart of the human race. And that actually reflects something of the diversity and union of God, I believe, right? Now, it's interesting. Dude, we're diverse in all sorts of ways, right? Like, dude, I like you said you like tacos Chihuahua. I like, John, you got your favorite taco place. We all have our favorite taco place. We like different types of music. So there are some, we have diversity of preferences.
Right.
Then there are some more that are maybe closer to who, like maybe our ethnicity or language or tradition. Those are more embedded who we are. But I believe we see here like the deepest core diversity running through the human race is male and female. And let me try and unpack that, because we're going to see that in Genesis 2. I would say what Genesis 2 is doing after this is it's taking this Genesis 1 poem, the image of God poem, and it's blowing it up and expanding it to give us the narrative, make sense of it, right? So if you remember Genesis 2, what does God do? He takes the Adam, puts him to sleep, pulls a woman from his side, and then they wake and they come together, and this is how families are going to be formed, how kids are going to come into the world, how they're going to be fruitful, multiply, all that, right?
Yep.
But here's the point. Here's a question I'd love to ask is, why did God create Adam and Eve differently? Like, not only like anatomically different, that kind of thing, but like using a different method. Like he makes Adam from the ground, but he makes Eve from Adam. Why does he do that? Well, the reason is because the unity of humanity. Like we're not created as separate individuals. He creates the one. He pulls the second from the one. You know, he turns the one into two, diversity. Yeah. Then these two are going to come back into union as one, and they're going to bring forth a
Procreate,
third. A third, right? You know, the triune image. Like many have argued, like the family is the triune image, the image of the Trinity, of the triune God.
That's
that it's
good.
through sexual union that when the two become one flesh, like in marriage and in sexual union together, like this is the means from which the one becomes three, in a sense, right? That the one life together, the beloved proceeds from the lover, and the love of their child like emerges as a concrete person between them. I'm getting abstract here, but let me just to try and bring it home is just to say that sexual difference is how you and I have come to exist. Like it has been the vehicle and means of our creation, and so and one of the implications of sexual union is that you and I are relationally made beings. Like, not just as like a cute concept, but going like, you wouldn't exist outside of the union of your parents, right? The two, however you came into the world, like.
And no one can argue that, right?
Yeah, no one can argue that, right? Like, it's the vehicle for existence. And so sexual ethics, I think, are so significant. When we talk about things like sexual ethics, but one of the reasons it's so significant is because the image of God is sexual in nature. Yeah. It's not all it is, but that's a part of it. You're being, it doesn't mean you have to, you know, and that gets us in complicated questions of like, intersex conditions and gender dysphoria and things like that are really important. But basic claim, I think, we'll do other podcasts on that. Yeah, I think, but basic claim for this is just going like, it's how you exist.
Yeah.
Like, even if you don't have to have sex to bear the image, and yet you only bear the image because others have had sex. Right? It's how you go in the world. Right. And that part, as a child, a son or a daughter or whatever, like that reflects your relational being in that sense. Like it reflects something of the triune relational God who's brought us into existence through this image-bearing nature of the family.
That's great. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
it's beautiful, man.
Josh, and I've always loved your image of or just, you know, what we see, that the beauty of diversity and union. And I always think like, I remember we had this conversation maybe a couple of years ago, and like you've just brought up ways that we feel that innately, right? Like when we see the sun and the day and the night come together at the sunset, right? Like we see the beauty of diversity and union when we're standing on a beach and the water is like at the sand, and earth and sea are meeting up together. Like we see the beauty of diversity and union. It's like all around us.
Yes.
And so, that's, I know there was a lot there, and these are like real big, heavy topics. And I think to give them the respect and time that they need, we'd probably need to do 15 other podcasts.
Yeah, totally.
But that was really helpful in just giving us a foundational view about how this view of the image of God, how it implicates.
Yeah. Well, John, you brought up earlier, too, there's a quote you had, because I think we talk about sexual ethics and bringing together sort of like the significance of that and even like the dignity of the human being.
Yeah.
Dude, you had
what was that quote?
So it's Peter Singer, and just this quote, what he says really kind of illustrates the importance of what we're talking about the Imago Dei, the image of God. And Peter Singer argues, he says that the life of a newborn baby, right, which we would say is made in the image of God, exactly what Josh just said, the life of a newborn baby has less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. And from that, he actually is arguing for humans, and specifically newborn babies, being used as in medical experiments instead of animals, because he says that animals have a higher cognitive functioning than a newborn baby.
True.
Yeah. And so when you see that, you start to say, like, even if some of this seems abstract, there are people in our world that are arguing against the very image of God. And another bioethicist that named Daniel Callahan, he also says that when someone loses their capacity to reason or have emotions, they can no longer be called a person. That they're no longer a person anymore. And he even makes the bold claim that sanctity of life no longer applies to that person.
Wow. And these are like influential philosophers, like kind of folks who would be seen as kind of ahead of the time, prestigious universities, things like that, who are kind of pushing the curve. And what's interesting to me about that, like that's a direct affront on the image of God from multiple angles. We see there one, like abortion, and then these more extreme. Now he's even going like, hey, outside of the womb, not only within, but outside, but even within the womb, abortion culture is going like, dude, you don't have dignity until you earn your personhood. You got to earn your personhood by getting out of that belly for,
That's right.
Or now he's going, well, even when you exit the belly, I remember reading the article, like he's going like, no, you still haven't earned your personhood until you meet a certain degree of rationality or IQ. And that hits on the image of God we talked about from a couple of angles. One is abortion culture is confronting the dignity of the image that we see in the substantive view, going, no, it's in your humanity. You don't have to earn it. It's something you've been given. And the substance, even in the like from conception, like in the womb, like you've received it in your humanity as a gift of God that you bear dignity before you could even speak a word, before you could earn it. You know? But it also confronts, I think, the third view, the relational one of going like, dude, what Singer's saying, and I'd say one of the things claims I would make with the ideology or logic of abortion is it's a works religion. Like you got to earn your personhood. You got to be born first, or now Singer's going, you got to meet a certain level of IQ. And what the relational view is saying is, no, your personhood is given to you from God. It's given to you from outside of yourself. It's received as a gift, as grace, through the union of those who came before you. You know, like it's actually something which I think has massive implications for going, I don't need to go out and prove myself to the world or create something in order to be worthwhile or valuable. Like, I have value because God's brought me forth into existence as sheer gift, grace.
Yeah, I think John, I loved your quote earlier about like these things that we're talking about when the image of God is violated. Like we're not talking about a theoretical thing that happens. We're talking about actual lives and atrocities.
Yeah, the worst things in the world.
The worst things in our history all stem from this violation or ignorance of like a person's value, the fact that a person is made in the image of God. So it is really an important thing that we understand. And so I think all three of these views, they have their like strengths and weaknesses in Scripture. But I think, Josh, what you said at the beginning here is that we don't have to look at them as like separate views, but that they're all working as this part of a diamond that all work together well. And so before we wrap up today, are there any final sort of words you have that you'd want people to walk away with from this conversation about the image of God?
Yeah, man. I'd just say this. I'd say to anyone listening going like, dude, the image of God, what does it mean for you? It means like, dude, the image is something you have because you're human. Dude, like you have a dignity. God has called you. He's brought you, he's brought you forth, right? You've been created by his hand. You have dignity as an image bearer. So the image of God is something that you have. It's also something that you're called to do, like to actually reflect him into the world through your vocation, through your family, through your life with your neighbors, that our character would reflect him through what we do and how we live, you know? And finally, though, that it's also someone that you are. Right. You know, like the image of God is you are a relational being made for community within humanity, your family, all that. But at a deeper level, like part of the identity of the church, Jesus wants to restore you into the healthy relationships that are rooted in God and love of God and love of one another, bringing you back into the union that you were made for as part of this communion of humanity that reflects the eternal love of the triune God.
Thanks, Josh.
It's good. Good to be on here with you guys, man talking about the image of God. Absolutely. And also hearing from Josh, because Josh you've been doing a lot on this with writing. So it's great to have you share some of this with us, man.
Yeah, and we can't wait to read your book and all this. We know that you're working hard on it, so we're all looking forward to reading it, Josh.
Thanks, man.
And so, I think the image of God is wrapped up really well in what we say often in our church here, and also the name of this podcast kind of shares the name. It's like all of life is all for Jesus, right? The way that we care for each part of our life reflects, it falls under Jesus' lordship, and it reflects that God is reflected in some way in whatever aspect of work, of our relationships, of any sort of the big issues of life, that God's image matters to those things. And so, guys, we are so grateful that you tuned in today. We're looking forward to talking to you again soon, and thank you for listening. And thanks, Josh and John. All right, so folks, as it's been like a tradition on this podcast, after the mics go off is some of when like the best content comes out. And so we just had one of those moments, and we were like, man, this is too good for us not to include this in on this episode.
Yeah.
So Josh, you had some additional thoughts on the substantive view of the image of God. Can you share some of those now? Yeah.
Totally, man. Yeah. So the functional view, actually, yeah. So if you remember,
sorry. Yeah.
no, that's great.
Yeah.
This is the one where in the ancient Near East, the context, you think about Israel's world back then, where these kings of the surrounding nations, they would put these statues of themselves all over their kingdom. And these were like their images, the images that represented them. And so in your world, like the king put statues of themselves throughout the land to represent them in their kingdom. And then you think Genesis 1, it's saying, dude, that's what God is doing. God is the king who is placing us, but like living statues throughout the land to represent him and his kingdom. Only their statues are made of wood and stone. God's statues are made of flesh and bone.
Yeah.
Right? Like we are the living statues that God has made, so to speak. Like we're alive, and he's called us to represent, to bear his image, to represent his reign and rule. And one of the other things, I think this helps us understand why idolatry is so heinous and significant. We are not to make images of God because we are images of God, right? Like one of the crazy things is the word idol and image in Hebrew, it's actually the same word, salem. Like you don't have one word for image, it's just the word salem. And so God makes idols, so to speak, right? Like God makes salem, he makes images of himself, only again, not of wood and stone, but of flesh and bone in the land. And so one of the reasons that we're not to make idols is it degrades our humanity. Like it actually is giving over something that God has called us to do to this little chunk of bark or whatever, a rock we chiseled,
Clay thing.
Which is no good. And so this is crazy though, because I think it sets up this theme that you're going to see traced throughout Scripture, that when God redeems his people in Exodus, their primary calling, he says in Exodus 19, is to be a kingdom of priests. And what that is they're to mediate God's kingdom into the world. He's restoring them as image bearers. This vocation that's been, it's not like people aren't image bearers anymore. It's not like the image has been demolished, but it has been corrupted and fractured and broken, and it's not working right. And so God is at work throughout the biblical story to restore the image in us, to bring us back to being a kingdom of priests, people who mediate and represent his reign and his rule into the land as his salem, the images, the living statues that God has made.
And so that was just
it was so good.
Yeah, some additional conversation we were having after the pod, after we finished recording, and we were like, man, this is so good. We just have to get this in. So, Josh, thanks for that. And this time, guys, we mean it. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of the All of Life podcast. To get more information on Redemption Church Tempe, you can download the Redemption Tempe app, or you can send an email to tempe@redemptionaz.com.